Yeah. All right. So I think it's time for you guys to draw one. Just tell me which one from the left, like which one do you want?
I can't see the number.
Oh yeah, that's the point, right?
So
What's your lucky number?
But there is a question that I think is
Sure.
a lot of people will want to know the answer to.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so can I pick? Because I know which one.
Sure, yeah, just pick a select one.
It's for you, and is monoclonal or recombinant antibody better than a polyclonal antibody?
Ah, I see. Okay, yeah. So that's a great question. Really depends on what better is. For different applications, that different things matter. Now I'm gonna run through all the scenarios and what all the factors considering each one and which one is better. Okay. So in terms of when people think monoclonal antibodies are better in general, but really what is good for is that it's repeatable. It's just one antibody that you can keep repeating it. It's not always the case. Recombinant protein, a recombinant antibody is absolutely recreatable. Let me silence this. First, have to define what better or good is. Let me run through a few scenarios. Right? Let's first talk about scenarios where monoclonal antibodies are better. Right? It's usually in clinical and production. Right? You want to make it into either a clinical diagnostic assay or a therapeutic. Then you want a monoclonal. In research, in the research phase, however, monoclonal antibody is not necessarily better. In fact, for as far as sensitivity goes, polyclonal antibody tend to have higher sensitivity. Unless you have a really strong monoclonal antibody, polyclonal antibody have stronger sensitivity for your average protein because there are multiple epitopes that it can bind to. It's the strength in numbers, right? Say you have a protein, it's got like 5 epitopes on it. And then when you use a polyclonal antibody, you can bind to like 4 epitopes on it, 4 times the signal, because every antibody carries a signal molecule with it. Whereas if you use a monoclonal, it binds to only one of them. Right? So chances are polyclonal antibody can bind to more, the valency per antigen for polyclonal antibody is much higher, and therefore the signal is much stronger. The only scenario where monoclonal antibody can generate a stronger signal than a polyclonal is if you find that one clone that's like super high sensitivity, a super high affinity that binds to just one epitope, but it binds so tight that it binds to like 100% of them and it never comes off. And over time, humanity have accumulated a lot of very classic, very good monoclonal antibodies for some of the more well-researched targets, like all the cell surface markers for phenotyping, for T cells, B cells, all of those. Those are great, right? There are a couple others that have very well-established clones that give more than sufficient amount of affinity. But those are, in the grand scheme of things, right? Consider the fact there are more than 20,000 protein in the human genome. There's maybe less than 500, in my opinion, less than 500 proteins that have well-established super monoclonals. The majority of them are still in the Wild West zone where monoclonal kind of suffers from having just one antibody against the thing. So in those scenarios, a polyclonal antibody is expected to give stronger, on average, in your typical immunoassay. The shortcoming of a polyclonal antibody, of course, is batch consistency. Most companies they don't test in the necessary vigorous robustness of the next batch, comparing with the first batch or the batch before, to make sure that it generates similar results. And then honestly, to be frank, like the things that matter to each group is so different that it's impossible to cover like all of them as well. So polyclonal antibody kind of falls short on that. So overall, I would say polyclonal antibody is a great way to cover grounds, right? Because it takes a couple $100 to make one. And if you want to like lots of antibody for lots of targets quickly, polyclonal antibody is the way to go. So usually happens that you make a bunch of good polyclonal antibodies, figure out what epitopes work well, and then you upgrade it to a monoclonal antibody. That's usually how it evolves. So, it's not necessarily, monoclonal antibodies are better, but eventually we want to get there, find some good ones. But if you just pull a average monoclonal antibody, right, chances are it's going to be weaker than the polyclonal antibody. Yeah. But once you find a very strong one, it's there forever. So that's kind of my take on it. Thanks for
Yeah, I think that's a really
bring it up.
common question, right?
Yeah,
I know when I started out, I had no idea. And working for the first company I worked for had just started making antibodies and like understanding the difference. And they were making hybridomas. So they were making, monoclonals. They were making highly specific, and the intention was for, potential diagnostic like troponin or something like that that's used for cardiac testing.
So since you mentioned hybridoma, I'll take another 2 minutes to talk about the various ways of making monoclonal antibody and their advantages and shortfalls. Hybridoma is kind of the first generation of monoclonal antibody making technology, and everybody knows it, right? Everybody knows how to make it. Well, a lot of people knows how to make it. However, it kind of falls short in terms of coming up with the really good antibodies. You really have to get lucky, right? The next gen antibody discovery technology, there's the kind of display type technologies with phages and yeast and sometimes mammalian cell lines, and there's also the B cell based where you screen the B cells directly and then you sequence it out to recombinantly reproduce it. Those are the two main categories. There are a bunch of in silico applications that are coming out, and we actually got a lot of clients that come up with a lot of in silico candidates and need to validate them on proteomics recently in the last 2 years or so, since AI became a thing. So those three approaches, let's leave the in silico aside, is still not matured enough to be used in a large number of scenarios, and most of it exploratory. But for the B cell and the phage display, the one factor that I have seen consistently making them more superior is really the number of, let's call it the high throughputness or the scale of screening or the number of candidates they are able to iterate through to find the good one. That's kind of the, I don't know how to describe that in a snappy phrase. Maybe you have one, let me know. But the total screening throughput, right, is the one factor that make a big difference. Basically, the more candidate you look through, the better chances you're going to find a really good one. Right? If you have the ability to kind of measure the goodness of one. On that scale, for hybridoma, you can only look at a couple hundred. If you want to risk getting, what's that thing called, a ris ratus? You want to, hurt your
carpal tunnel.
Carpal tunnel, yeah. You want to get carpal tunnel, you can maybe get a couple thousand, but that's really where it ends, right? In the hundreds to low thousands, unless you want to, really go at it. So you can only look at that many candidates. And then there's also the bias where the B cell just don't survive the fusion, right? Like the good B cell can be eliminated due to reasons not related to the affinity and the specificity of the B cell, right? So that creates a bias, and also you just can't look more than like a couple thousand. So that's where the limitation is. So hybridoma is kind of just hit and miss, especially given the fact that hybridoma is made with mouse B cells. Makes it even worse.
Yeah. They started making them with rabbit too, though, right?
Yeah. So the rabbit hybridoma is a little better. It has to do with the why rabbit is good, but the way I like to look at it is really mouse is bad. It's not a rabbit is better. It's not a rabbit is good. Rabbit is just about as good as any like mammal, but rat is really bad. Mouse is really bad. And here's what I think is why I don't have a white paper on this, but mouse, their reproductive cycle is shorter than their adaptive immune response cycle, right? So really, like, all they really have to do well evolutionarily is to kind of just rush forward, crank out a bunch of small mice, baby mice, and then that's it. Right? They don't like not having a well-established adaptive immune system while your reproduction span is shorter than what it takes to react efficiently. Then that creates a lot. That makes the evolutionary pressure of having a good immune system very low. Because what's the use of that system when it doesn't kick in when you reproduce, right? So I think that's why mouse have a uncharacteristically weak adaptive, or like they're just winging it in terms of an adaptive immune system, right? But their innate immune system is like super strong. That's why we have so many like false positives, false negatives, and false positives in mice culture, because they live in a different world, right? They reproduce so fast that they just kind of punk out a bunch of small mice, and it doesn't matter if they die, right? If we use any other model organism that doesn't have that kind of dynamic, they will have better predictivity of a lot of the drugs we use, right? So I think that's why mice kind of suck at making good antibodies, because to survive they don't need to, right? To kind of survive evolutionarily, they don't need that.
They're like the weeds of the mammalian world, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like Arabidopsis is a great weed, not because it's a very hardy plant, but because it has 10,000 babies every reproductive cycle.
Yeah, and those babies have a high, you give it a drop of water and yeah.
Yeah,
so I think that's
they
why
have a high termination rate. Yeah, they do. They are relatively good survivors, but it's really all about the numbers, right?
Yeah, the numbers game. Absolutely.
So yeah, mouse is kind of like a weed because they have so many babies so quickly.
Yeah. Before they ever make their first IgG, right? Like that's another thing that people may not know is that after repeated immunization, the IgG percentage of a mouse's antibody portfolio is still low. Right? Like after like 4 immunization, rabbit IgG percentage will get up to the 95% and up, whereas mice is still like majority IgM for like short-term, response. So that's why mice is so much worse. But that kind of that's sorry that you sidetracked the conversation from the different ways of making monoclonal, but mouse just sucks at making good antibodies. So the other two, B cell screening can screen up in the hundreds of millions per assay. Phage display can screen at however much you want, right? Just let it run for a couple months. And then the B cell based technologies are really taking up a lot of the interest because the screening efficiency is much more. It's much cheaper to do because the screening efficiency is much higher, and then the downstream is much easier to do. But I think that topic really deserves a more dedicated discussion. I would just leave it there.